To be killed by a serial killer, one must be quite unlucky. The number of people killed every year by serial killers varies from country to country. By some estimates, the average number of serial killer victims each year ranges from 67 to 180, depending on where you're from. It is a difficult task for enforcement officers to keep a track. It's not always clear whether a murder was committed by a serial murderer or just a regular murderer. Sometimes they don't even find the bodies until much, much later. A serial killer is a person who commits a series of murders, often with no apparent motive and typically following a characteristic, predictable behavior pattern. A similar style of killing, a similar method, a certain area that they kill in, and a certain victim could all be part of a serial killer's MO, and this would lead detectives to believe that these murders were committed by a serial killer or a serial murderer. Some serial killers are made notorious from urban legends or pop culture, like John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, or Ted Bundy. Others by making history, like Charles Manson. Some of you may not have even heard of the likes of Luis Garavito, who has 138 confirmed victims, mainly homeless South American children, or Pedro Lopez, with 110 confirmed victims, also South American homeless children. Even the third most victims for any serial killer was from South America, who killed, again, homeless South American children. All of them could have more than 300 victims each. You don't even really hear about these killers in pop culture. The US has a fascination with serial killers. Most serial killers are from the US. It's something that all of these serial killers have in common is the fact that they were caught and faced serious, sometimes fatal consequences for their horrifying actions. I'm Micah, and today on Obscure Review, we're going to be looking at active serial killers. We've excluded unsolved historical murders like Jack the Ripper. We wanted to mainly focus on serial killers that are currently active. Ones that are possibly lurking in your city, your neighborhood, possibly hiding in your apartment, or shopping at your local mall. First off, we have the Rainbow Maniac. July 2007, Sao Paulo, Brazil. A killer who was later dubbed the Rainbow Maniac begins an unprecedented series of murders. Spanning from February 2008 to March 2009, the Rainbow Maniac killed 13 supposedly gay men, all in Pituras Park. The spot was a well-known gay meetup in the Carapicuíba area. On the night of the 4th of July 2007, a serial killer stalked Jose Siqueiro Enrique. This victim was not like the other victims, as it was obvious to law agencies that the serial killer was targeting homosexuals, but in this case he had murdered a 32-year-old married mechanic taking an evening stroll. His wife was later notified by police of his horrific murder. The Rainbow proceeded to murder 12 more men, 11 of them with gunshots to the head and body, and one with brutal blunt force trauma to the head. His most recent victim, Ivanildo Francisco de Sal Neto, a 25-year-old man, was beaten to death on March 15, 2009. What's interesting about this serial killer is that the clues pointed to the retired police sergeant Jairo Francisco Franco being the killer. A witness claimed to have seen Franco shoot a man in the park who was described to have been black and gay 12 times. Another witness told police that they had seen Franco visit the park many times during the spate of killings. He was arrested but later released without conviction from a 4-2 jury ruling. Since the murder of Neto in 2009, there have been no more killings linked to the Rainbow Maniac. Could this be because Franco was taken into custody? Or did the killer get cold feet? We may never know. The Johannesburg Killer. South Africa is not the first country that comes to mind when serial killings is the topic. Even so, serial killing is more common in some African nations than you might think. The ABC Killer with 38 victims, or Al Turbini an Egyptian serial killer with 32 victims, all of whom were street children. One serial killer thought to still be active in Africa is the Johannesburg killer. This killer was active during the early to late 2000s. The deaths of 4 homosexual men in and around the Johannesburg area were not initially investigated by police, but the local protesting led to an investigation from local police enforcement. Since their investigations have begun, 9 homosexual men have been bound and strangled to death. Police have not yet determined a killer, but several suspects are being inspected. The Long Island killer. One serial killer operating in the Long Island area has been at their grisly trade since the early 90s. This murderer has perpetrated at least 16 killings over the last 20 years. The accidental discovery of human remains on Gilgo Beach in 2010 began the investigation into this serial killer's grotesque acts. The authorities later found the decomposed bodies of more than 10 victims, whose murders date back to the mid-90s. 4 of the sets of remains found since late 2010 have been identified as missing sex workers who all advertised their services on Craigslist. They were all strangled and their bodies were wrapped in burlap sacks before being dumped along Gilgo Beach. All were most likely killed elsewhere and later dropped at their final resting location. A distressing belief held by investigators is that the killer has a background in law enforcement which has aided them in eluding capture all these years. Though one possible suspect was sentenced to 46 months in federal prison in 2015 on unrelated charges, but was later released. It is pretty likely that the police have more of this killer's victims to find. The B1 Butcher. In both June and July 2007, body parts were found wrapped in garbage bags along the B1 national route in Namibia. These remains, the remains of 2 women, were the beginning of a slew of body part discoveries and disappearances in the Windhoek area of this African nation. The serial killer had a particular taste for young ladies, taking them to a secluded hideaway, murdering them, and storing their bodies in cold storage. They would then dismember the bodies, wrapping them in rubbish bags, before hiding the bodies along the B1 highway. The killer garnered the name B1 Butcher in relation to the way the bodies were mutilated and stored before being presented to the public. Remains of the killer's victims were periodically discovered between 2005 and 2007. 3 of the 5 victims have been identified as prostitutes who work a certain area. 3 of the 5 victims were later identified as prostitutes. In 2010, Namibia was again thrown into dread at the fear that the B1 Butcher was back at his trade due to the discovery of a head and an arm buried in rubbish bags in the Windhoek region. The most terrifying part of these serial killings is the erratic murder style and lack of evidence pointing authorities in any particular direction. A German traveler was arrested on suspicion of strangling a Namibian woman to death, but was later acquitted due to lack of evidence. Public scrutiny of authorities had prompted a civilian team of hunters looking for the identity of the killer. Neil Hall. In 2015, Heather Saul, a working girl from West Virginia, was home alone when 46-year-old Neil Falls entered her home unpronounced. Heather turned to find the intruder with a gun pointing to her head. She froze. He grabbed her by the throat, cutting off her circulation and oxygen completely. As Neil strangled her, Saul grabbed a nearby rake. Neil let go of her neck and fought for control of the rake. He laid his gun down in order to get the rake. Heather, seeing her opportunity, grabbed hold of the gun and fired behind her at the attacker. Neil was hit multiple times and died at the scene. Heather made a hasty escape. Reports say that upon inspection, police found a machete, axes, knives, a shovel, a sledgehammer, bleach, plastic trash bags, bulletproof vests, clean white socks, and underwear on Neil's body. Police linked many of these items and other artifacts found on Neil's person to the multiple murders that had occurred around the time of this incident. More than 10 women disappeared in and around Las Vegas during this time. Sometime earlier, a young man had discovered a pair of legs in Divon, Illinois. The victim fell prey to Fall's murderous heinous acts. The 10 plus victims were all known prostitutes and were murdered across a number of states, including Ohio, Illinois, and Nevada. Probably the most terrifying aspect of this case is that Neil Falls had a list of 6 female names. These 6 potential victims on the list had their full names, ages, phone numbers in Neil's possession. Police redacted the names and gave those in the crosshairs protective custody. Heather Saul was never charged for the shooting and was actually praised for her bravery and saving many other girls from having their lives taken by Falls. Controversy still remains over this killer, as despite Neil Falls' death, his victims continue to stack up. More than 8 fatalities matching this killer's MO have been discovered since his death. Some dark and terrifying desire to kill in a certain style and manner eclipses people, leading them to become the most terrifying murderers to walk among us. The planned out deviation of these animals leads to a fearful terror to run amongst the general public, as authorities and psychologists work to identify what it is that makes serial killers inches ever closer. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Subscribe if you would like to see more, and if you did like the video, give it a thumbs up and let me know what you thought.